Academician Andriy Sakharov is a world-class scientist, fighter for the truth, and simply a good-hearted and frank man. He is known by scientists around the entire world as a renowned physicist and the developer of nuclear weapons. He is famous not only for in the sphere of science, but is also one of the founders of the human rights movement in the entire former Soviet Union, and a laureate of the Nobel Peace Prize. He took active part in the protection of Ukrainian political prisoners. He led Ukrainian dissidents by his example to fight against the totalitarian regime and for human rights. At the same time, when the USSR was isolated from the outside world, such authoritative individuals as Andriy Sakharov informed society on human rights violations.
Андрей Дмитриевич Сахаров прошел сложный путь от советского ядерщика до диссидента.
Andriy Sakharov has gone down a long and difficult path from a Soviet nuclear engineer to a dissident. Once he realized this, his voice was heard around the world, and this dealt a heavy blow to the Soviet power regime. Imagine that an academician and three-time hero of the Soviet Union took the side of political dissidents and became an influential advocate of human rights.
Дважды герой социалистического труда и даже трижды, по-моему, и вдруг переходит на сторону диссидентов и начинает выступать за права человека.
In his homeland of Russia, very few people remember Sakharov. In his native country where he was born and where he died, he was not needed. Moreover, he posed a serious threat to the regime in Soviet Russia at the time. Sakharov is remembered and respected in Ukraine for his successful challenge to the Soviet system. In December 2016, a book titled Hero of the Soviet Union about Andriy Sakharov was presented in Kyiv in honor of the anniversary of the death of Sakharov.
Сахаров останется, причем останется в памяти не только нашей, бывших советских людей, украинцев, он останется как мать Тереза для всего мира.
Sakharov remains not only in the memory of the former Soviet people in Ukraine, but also in the memory of the entire world as the male personification of Mother Teresa. We want to honor the memory of the day of Sakharov's passing in Odessa. After that, we will hold rallies in other Ukrainian cities. This is very important for us, as Ukrainians seeing it as in today's difficult and moral situation in our country. We desperately need a moral mentor and luminary like Sakharov.
Нравственной, очень непростой ситуации, нам очень нужен Сахаров.
Speaking the truth, Sakharov contributed a great deal to the development of Ukraine, for which Ukrainians honor and remember him. It seems to me that today Ukraine truly lacks Andriy Sakharov. Indeed, we lack people whose greatness is measured on a global scale and whose simplicity is absolutely evident from the advocacy point of view. Taking into consideration the current situation in Ukraine, namely aggression of outside forces and the protection of the territorial integrity, human rights protection is the most urgent issue. This is particularly felt in the occupied territories in Crimea and Donbass. In short, Ukraine lacks the intervention of international advocacy organizations. Andriy Sakharov became active in the human rights protection movement and public activities in the mid-1960s. As the developer of a nuclear bomb, he understood that this deadly weapon could exterminate millions of people. Sakharov also understood that his invention could fall into the wrong hands of dictators, who could use it at any moment to achieve their mythical goals. The triumph of this scientific discovery in physics could have catastrophic repercussions of a global scale. Sakharov devoted his entire further activity to the de-escalation and prevention of military conflicts, adherence to the rights and freedoms of citizens, and the humanization of Soviet society.
Голос генерала Григоренко был очень...
The words of General Hirorenko have been quoted the most. Seeing as he was a frontline soldier in general, it was difficult to incriminate him for espionage as a mole of the CIA.
Трудно ему было инкриминировать, что он наймит ЦРУ.
For this reason, Soviet authorities tried to drive Hirorenko mentally insane and forced him to undergo psychiatric examinations. On May 13, 1970, Andriy Sakharov, together with like-minded persons, appealed to the USSR Prosecutor General with a complaint enforceable by supervision in response to a ruling of the Tashkent Local Court and the Supreme Court of the Uzbek Soviet Socialistic Republic to win the case of Petro Hirorenko. In 1970, Sakharov, together with other scientists, established and headed the USSR Committee on Human Rights. Since that time, Sakharov and the Committee on Human Rights made a stand for imprisoned workers in Ukrainian culture. On May 22, 1971, agents of the USSR Committee for State Security arrested Ukrainian poet Anatoly Lupinis for his ceremonial speech at the monument to Taras Shevchenko in honor of the Ukrainian Kobzar. Andriy Sakharov purposely flew from Moscow to attend the court hearings against the poet and described the events in his memoirs. In the morning, others joined me in a hotel and we went together to the court. On our way to the court, someone recounted to us the essence of the matters. Lupinis already had a previous conviction on his record for spreading nationalistic propaganda. While imprisoned in a camp, he became seriously ill. For some time, he could move only with the help of a wheelchair, and he eventually got around on crutches. In spring 1971, he recited verses together with other poets at the monument to Taras Shevchenko. One of the verses contained a phrase about the national Ukrainian flag that had been turned into a rag. Someone leaked information about this anti-Soviet nationalistic speech, and he was arrested. Much to the surprise of all those who attended the court hearing, they were freely admitted into the courtroom, but the court hearing had not been opened. Finally, a secretary said the judge fell ill, although one of us saw him in the morning, and the hearing was adjourned. The date of the hearing was postponed due to our appearance at the court. In 2 weeks, the court hearing was held totally unexpectedly for all of us. Lupinis was sent to a special mental health clinic in Dnipro, one of the oldest hospitals. From 1972 to 1975, Leonid Plush stayed in the hospital and told stories about the institution. Lupinis spent 8 years in the hospital as punishment for uttering a one-verse phrase. Sakharov was acquainted with very few Ukrainian human rights activists. He knew all of them by name, knew their biographies, and constantly remembered them during his public speeches, giving his regular interview to foreign journalists. Sakharov exclaimed the absurdity of the Soviet system and told about the tragic fate of Ukrainian dissident Oleksiy Tiki. In 1957, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison for disapproving response to Khrushchev. When he was freed from prison, Khrushchev was no longer in power. He was removed for his so-called volunteer course and ordered him not to recall this. So this meant that he was right in criticizing Khrushchev's regime. He was wrongfully convicted and served a term of 7 years in prison for nothing. But only was he not rehabilitated, but nobody apologized to him. Moreover, when he was arrested for the second time as a reactivist and a previously convicted dangerous criminal in 1977, he was handed down a sentence for him was nothing short of death. Indeed, he was sentenced to 10 years in concentration camps and 5 years in exile. On May 6, 1984, he died in a prison hospital in the Perm region of Russia. This is not the single case. When Sakharov asserted the rights of imprisoned activists of Ukrainian culture before the authorities, in 1975, Andriy Sakharov was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for fearless support of fundamental principles of peace between people in the courageous struggle against abuse by authorities and other forms of suppression of human dignity. Of course, the Soviet authorities banned him from traveling abroad to the conferred prize. Sakharov's wife, Olena Bonner, attended the award ceremony in his place. At the ceremony in Oslo, Norway, Bonner read a letter of Sakharov addressed to the Nobel Committee. The letter contained the surnames of Ukrainian political prisoners: Valentin Moroz, Chornovil, Plushchik, Ivan Barony, Nina Strovkata, Vasyl Stus, Levko Levashenko, Yuri Stuvja, Seaman Gluzman, and many others. Sakharov also wrote about the prosecutions of Crimean Tatars and about the activist of the Crimean Tatar movement, Mustafa Demiliv, who has been in a prison for several years waiting for his sentence to be passed down.
Andriy
Sakharov has played a big role in the Crimean Tatar national movement, especially in my life. I am grateful for him and I managed to survive. In 1969, Mustafa became a co-founder of one of the first Soviet human rights organizations, Initiative Group for Human Rights Protection in the USSR, so Sakharov had a special relationship with him. He attended 2 court hearings against him, in 1976 in Omsk and in 1979 in Tashkent. Truthfully, I didn't see him present at the court hearings because it was a closed-door trial, but only one of his showings at the trial had its impact as Sakharov tried to attract the attention of the world community to see these problems. It was Sakharov who appealed to Ivan to stop his 300-day hunger strike when the latter was serving a term in the Omsk prison. In April 1976, the Omsk City Court convicted him to 2.5 years in prison for his accusations of anti-Soviet activity. Before Mustafa was sentenced to concentration camps to serve his prison term, he was allowed to see his mother and brother.
Мать долго не смогла, она заплакала, ее вывели, брат остался, он говорит...
My mother couldn't hold back her tears. She was escorted out of the visiting room, but my brother stayed behind and said to me, "I don't know what the arguments, I shouldn't make force to stop the hunger strike, but I have sold another argument." He showed me a letter through the glass window. I can't remember the content of the full text, but most of all I remember the words, "Dear Mustafa, it seems I have done everything possible to have you released. Now I have only one request to you. Please stop the hunger strike."
Я сделал все возможное для твоего освобождения, а сейчас у меня просьба. Прекрати голодовку.
Because our enemies will be delighted when you die. I think it was a very convincing argument for me to stop the strike. This person has done much to help me survive, so I wouldn't turn down his request. And that very same day I stopped the hunger strike.
Для спасения моей жизни. И отказывать ему уже было, конечно, очень некорректно. Я в тот же день написал заявление о снятии голодовки.
The Ukrainian Helsinki group, known as the Human Rights Protection Organization, was established with the participation of Sakharov. In summer 1975, a final act of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe was signed in Helsinki to put into practice the humanitarian articles in this document, in particular legal obligations in the sphere of human rights. On May 12, 1976, the Ukrainian Helsinki group was established in Moscow. It was the first such group to be established on the territory of the former Soviet Union. Russian dissidents began active work on creation of similar groups in the former Soviet republics. Sakharov personally knew Ukrainian human rights activists, in particular writer Mykola Rudenko. They participated in the activities of the human rights organization Amnesty International, which began its activity in the USSR in the early 1970s. In his memoirs, Sakharov recalls meeting with Rudenko as he was reading the manuscript of his pamphlet titled Goodbye to Marx. Following the establishment of the Moscow group, Sakharov proposed Rudenko to establish a similar group in Ukraine. Rudenko held consultation with the leaders of the Ukrainian human rights movement, Levko, Oksana Meshko, Oles Bernaduk, Ivan Karbos, and others. On November 9, 1976, Rudenko held a press conference for foreign journalists in the apartment of Sakharov in Moscow. The creation of the Ukrainian Helsinki group was announced. In 1980, for the criticism of the Soviet government in Afghanistan, Sakharov was deprived of all state awards and honorary degrees and sent into exile into the city of Gorky. In late 1986, he was allowed to return to Moscow. In 1988, on the initiative of Academician Sakharov, the Historical, Educational, Human Rights, and Charitable Society Memorial was established in the former Soviet republics. The memorial operates in Ukraine to this day. While defending the rights of Soviet people, Andriy Sakharov did not rule out the context of his struggle for Ukrainian human rights activists and political prisoners. In 1986, he managed to convey a list of prisoners of consciousness to U.S. President Ronald Reagan, which contained the names of 23 Ukrainians. Reagan started negotiations with Gorbachev, which took place in Reykjavik, Iceland in October 1986. The death of Sakharov on December 14, 1989 was a great tragedy for many Ukrainians. His memory is still revered around the world. Streets and cities of Israel and Ukraine were named after him, and the European Parliament established the Andriy Sakharov for Freedom of Opinion Prize in honor of the world-renowned academician.